We're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about Canada's economy because for the first time this year, we've had a quarterly shrink of 1.6%, a little bit steeper than what was originally expected. Here to talk about it is Senior Economics Lecturer at Concordia University, Moshe Lander. Thanks for being here.
Hello.
So is this sort of, like I mentioned, it's a little bit steeper than what we were expecting. Is this something that we should be concerned about with the economy?
You should always be concerned when the economy is shrinking. It's not a good sign. I think that part of it is maybe a bit of a distortion because the first quarter was more growth than what we expected. And part of that was because the Trump tariffs, when they kicked in, were preceded by a huge amount of Canadian exports to try and beat the tariffs. So it probably overstated GDP. So once everybody got in before the tariffs, then they scaled back their production. And now what we're seeing is in the second quarter, it shrunk a little more than expected. Look at the two numbers together. The economy is flat. That's not a good sign ever. But hey, we're under our worst tariff threat in 90 years. So the fact that we're not talking recession outright is probably a good sign.
Okay, so this is kind of that tariff threat coming home to roost. As you mentioned, we were trying to get ahead of it before, which maybe artificially inflated it. This is the impact now.
Yeah, and at some point, right, remember that the tariffs are taxes on American imports. So somebody has to pay for that tariff. If it's the American consumer, then the law of demand says that if the price goes up for them, they want to buy less, which means that we're going to be providing them less. And so when you scale back production, that shows up in the GDP numbers. If we are absorbing it, kind of the old Trump adage of I'm going to build a wall and get Mexico to pay for it.
Sure.
If the Canadian producers are the ones who are having to eat the tariff, then they too would scale back production and that would show up in the GDP numbers.
Okay. So part of this is that the exports are down, but there's a domestic spending increase. So that means that Canadians are buying more Canadian. Is that right?
That is true.
Is that putting a dent in the numbers? Is that encouraging in any way, or are we still...
It is and it isn't. Now, I know I usually land myself in a little bit of trouble when I say this, but those Canadian products were always available, right? It's not that they just showed up in the last couple of months and businesses have sprung up in response to the tariffs.
Right.
So when we had access to those Canadian products all along and we didn't buy them, why? It's because the American products that we were buying were better quality for the same price or same quality for a lower price, or in many cases, higher quality and a lower price. So the fact that we've now shifted to Canadian, great, it's propping up the economy a little bit, but it's really that we're buying second-rate stuff, relatively speaking, and that's not good for our standard of living. If they were always available to us and we didn't want it before, the only reason we're wanting it now is because of hurt feelings or because we're trying to boycott the U.S., but that's inflicting damage on ourselves. And hey, if you're understanding that that's the trade-off, I have no problems with it, but I think a lot of Canadians were reacting more with their heart, with their brain.
How does that inflict more damage on ourselves to buy Canadian?
Well, if you're buying lower quality at a higher price, when it was always available to you, it really is that you have always viewed it as a second best. Mm-hmm. So you're now buying second best options. There's nothing wrong with being patriotic. It's just understand that that makes your cost of living and affordability issues even more acute.
Okay. So we talked about last quarter how perhaps there was overinflated numbers because of all these exports going out. This is maybe more realistic, this one. What about next quarter? Like, what are we expecting? Is this going to be a trend that continues?
So the third quarter would end at the end of September. So we're not going to see those numbers probably until end of October. When we get those numbers, it's likely going to show that the Canadian economy was at best flat, maybe even a small contraction, right? The Canadian summer is always funky because most Canadians are not going to travel to the U.S. during the summer anyway, because we have the nice weather here. So it's to what extent did Americans come up to Canada compared to last year? If fewer of them came because maybe they're afraid of Canada or they're worried about the reception that they're going to get, then that's the type of thing that would probably drag the economy down into technical recession territory.
Okay. And what kind of impact do you think that's going to have on everyday lives, jobs, spending money?
So I hate the way the kids refer to it these days, but the kids have referred to the me session. I guess that's just the way that Gen Z and millennials see the world. The me session idea, though, I do like, even though I don't like the wording, which is if you have a job, if your family have jobs, if your friend have jobs, I can come here on the radio and say, yeah, we're in a recession. And everyone's going to look around and say, I don't see it.
Right.
And if I tell you that the economy is growing and you don't have a job, your friends don't have a job, your family don't have a job, you're going to look around and say, I don't see it. So it's almost like the social mediaification of the way that people see their world, is that it's limited to just the people that are in their likes, dislikes, followers, followed. And if they don't feel that there's a recession, it really doesn't matter what I say. I think what we're going to find is that a lot of people are feeling that whether I tell you there's a recession or not, they feel like there's a recession because it's just really hard to find jobs these days. And even if you have a job, you're just finding that it's harder and harder to make ends meet.
We've been talking a lot about how industries that rely on these exports are going to start to shrink, and we've already seen layoffs at automotive factories, places like that. Is it possible that this shrinking of the economy starts to affect other industries as well?
Absolutely. So, we talk about the headline industries, right? Aluminum and steel here in the province, automotive next door, going in the other direction, it's forestry and fisheries. At some point, the lumber tariffs are coming. Yeah. So, it's going to affect that. But let's think secondarily and tertiary industries. What if you work at the local Tim Hortons and every day the auto workers stop by your Tim Hortons to pick up a coffee when they're going in for their shift or pick up a coffee when they're leaving their shift? Well, if you're not going in for your shift anymore, you're probably not going to Tim Hortons anymore. And so next thing you know, some Tim Hortons employee might say, I lost my job or I lost my shifts. And the only reason is because the auto industry was affected by the tariffs. So it can actually filter down into the most weird industries that you wouldn't think about. And so we wouldn't necessarily think of it as being tariff related, but it is.
And you can kind of sort of see the death spiral start to happen there. Are we anywhere close to that? Or is that still some sort of far off risk?
Yeah, I think it's a far off situation, right? Don't forget that the unemployment rate is still pretty low by Canadian standards. It's high relative to the last few years. But if you told me 25 years ago that Canada would have an unemployment rate in the 6% range, I think most of us would sign up for it. Okay.
I do want to ask you about the impact this could have on interest rates. Are we going to see more rate cuts?
Yeah. Everything local matters. So listen, the Bank of Canada is going to meet in a couple of weeks. They've been hesitating cutting interest rates because there's this tension that on the one hand, inflationary pressures are a little bit there because of the tariffs.
Right.
Yet at the same time, the economy is weak. So you can't simultaneously increase and cut interest rates at the same time. So they've just been kicking it down the road saying, well, we'll meet in another 6 weeks and we'll decide then. I think it's pretty likely now when they meet in September, if not the meeting after that, there's at least 1/4 percentage point cut coming, maybe even 2 before the end of the year. They have 3 meetings left and they probably won't go more than 1/4% at a time.
Okay. And can you just explain how that could help?
Well, anybody who has a variable rate mortgage, line of credit, student loan, car loan, anything that has an interest rate attached to it, if the Bank of Canada cuts their key rate, it's the ankle bones connected to the knee bones connected to so everything's going to get cut accordingly. And so you should find that there's an extra 1/4 percentage point cut. That doesn't necessarily mean more money in your pocket. It just means you can pay your debts off faster.
Okay. Just before I let you go, I got to ask you about the very confusing situation with the TSX index right now, because we're talking about all these different threats to the economy and potential recession on the horizon. And yet the TSX index is breaking records every day and closed on Friday, the highest it's ever closed. So what is the difference between the real economy, people in factories making stuff, and Bay Street, where you've got, investments going through the roof?
Yeah, so your money has to be channeled somewhere. And so if people are yanking their money out of spending, then they're putting their money into saving. And remember that somebody's saving is somebody else's borrowing. So that money is being channeled probably into investment vehicles. So it's finding its way into the stock market. But there's probably also gambling that the interest rate's going to go down, and that's generally good for the economy. And it's probably an idea that at least now some of the uncertainty is gone. If you remember the way the stock market was gyrating at the beginning of the tariffs, it was, where is this going to lead? We at least have a bit of a better idea where we're going. And that's the type of thing that can actually create a little more confidence, weird as it might sound, that, all right, at least this is the devil that we know now for the next 3.5 years. And that might make people a little more comfortable putting their money into investment vehicles.
All right. Thank you for helping try to make it make sense a little bit. Moshe Lander is a senior lecturer in the economics department at Concordia University. Appreciate you coming in.
Anytime.